Hello, this is the first of what we hope will be 12 classes talking about the life and letters of St. Paul. I hope that by the time this class airs, I will have been able to find a list of all of your emails and been able to send you this material. There should be for almost every lecture, perhaps not everyone. No, I think for every lecture, there should be a handout for you to look at. I have 3 here. Facts on the life of St. Paul, on the life of Saul of Tarsus. Possible chronological table of the life of Paul. That's from F.F. Bruce's book, Paul the Apostle of the Heart Set Free, which I hope you're reading or have read. And this Paul Missions and Ministry, which is a sort of sketch outline of the part of the book of Acts that deals with St. Paul. And we're going to look at all of these. There is a great deal to be said about the historical, about the life of St. Paul and what we know about it and how we can know about it. That this will come up as we go along. It would be interesting. F.F. Bruce does talk about this in his book. Everyone talks about this in their books. I have seen recently that the Jesus Seminar people have now done a book on Acts, which they treat the same way they treated the Gospels in their previous work. And one of the things that is clear from, I read a scholarly review of this book, I haven't seen the book itself. One of the things that's clear is that the first thing they want to do is date the book of Acts so late that it tells you virtually nothing historically accurately about the life of St. Paul. In other words, the Jesus Seminar people find the picture of St. Paul in Acts intolerable. They can't stand it and they have to do away with it. They're not the first people in Christian history who thought that St. Paul was intolerable. Sometimes a lot of Christians in the church thought St. Paul was intolerable. There are quite a number of intolerable saints. That's a subject for another day. But it is interesting that the way you treat things historically can be very much affected by your own theological and religious predispositions. The only way to do scholarship at all responsibly is to try to resist that as much as possible. I believe that the Book of Acts is a pretty good historical source. As far as we can judge it, we can't judge it very far because it comes in the middle of a space of time when it's pretty much the only historical source there is, so there's not really much to judge it against. But insofar as we can judge it, it seems to be quite good. I hope that is a conclusion which is not controlled by the fact that it is a scriptural book. We can't talk about how to read scriptural books that one thinks are not historical right now. We can't do that. Can't talk about everything. That's a big topic. But I do think that the Book of Acts is a dependable historical source, and I will treat it that way because that's what I think. F.F. Bruce thinks it too. If it is true, then the Book of Acts is tremendously important for the life of St. Paul. And of course, it's also important for what we think about the letters in the New Testament that purport to be by St. Paul. A number of these letters are contested by modern scholars. Certainly we don't know, we can't know that St. Paul wrote any of the letters that we have or caused them to be written. There's no way we could possibly know that. We don't know that anyone whose name comes down to us attached to a biblical book actually wrote it. There's no way that we could possibly know that. How are you going to check? That's true of virtually every ancient work. We don't know that. You can't demonstrate even something as pedestrian as the fact that Caesar is responsible for the first 7 books of Caesar's Gallic Wars, which I believe everyone thinks is true, but we can't demonstrate it. Anyway, the that historical question can be a dead end if you let yourself get taken down it too far. So what we are going to do first is I have now declared that for reasons that will become clearer as we go along, that I am going to treat the Book of Acts as an historical source. I think it is, and it is, of course, for us a scriptural book, which is not exactly, as I said, the same thing, but it is a scriptural book for us. Sorry, I'm trying to adjust the lighting here. I'm doing this during the daytime, which I almost never do, and I'm having trouble with getting the lighting to work. Scripture is mysterious, but it's not supposed to be something you read in the dark. So, I don't know if that's going to be better or not. Maybe that's more confusing. Well, anyway. Okay, we'll go like that. Maybe better if I wear a darker shirt, but I have to go out dressed up after this, so I didn't want to change too many times. To begin, there are some particular things that I believe we can say that the Book of Acts tells us about St. Paul. Particular historical nuggets that I think are useful to consider as a background to the letters. Now, the general picture of St. Paul we are going to look at in a few minutes, and I think that's also important, but against the backdrop of the dramatic stories about St. Paul in Acts that I think are very important for getting to know something of his character, we need to know what are the facts that we have outside of the letters about St. Paul. And that's what this sheet, Facts on the Life of Saul of Tarsus, is supposed to talk about. Now, to begin with, in the book of Acts, chapter 21, verse 39, Paul is getting arrested in Jerusalem. This is the time that he gets arrested, and he's imprisoned for the rest of the book of Acts, which I perhaps don't need to remind you, comes to an end with him still in imperial custody, and it just stops. So as far as the Bible is concerned, we don't know what happens to St. Paul. There are, of course, early Christian stories. More about that later, but the Bible doesn't tell us. As far as we know, the Bible, in the New Testament, St. Paul never gets to Rome. In the New Testament, St. Paul never dies. Okay, I assume that he did die because he's a human being. I think he probably got to Rome, but the Bible doesn't require me to believe that. Okay, so Paul is getting arrested by the Roman soldiers who are in the fort right next to the temple in Jerusalem. By the way, I'm reading the Orthodox Study Bible this year, so that's what I'm using to read to you. As Paul was about to be led into the barracks, this is chapter 21, verse 37. He said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" He replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." Okay. We get two immediate facts about that. From that, first, Paul claims to be from Tarsus in Cilicia, a Jew, and also Paul is at least bilingual, because they begin conversing, and then the commander replies, "Oh, can you speak Greek?" So clearly, they're probably speaking Aramaic, maybe Hebrew, but clearly they're not speaking Greek because the commander is conversing with him and says, "Oh, do you speak Greek?" And if the conversation were in Greek, he would already know that he speaks Greek. Okay, so we know that Paul is at least bilingual, probably Aramaic. Hard sometimes to tell exactly what language. So Paul is from Tarsus and is bilingual. Okay, if we look at chapter 22, the next chapter, when they take him, when he is he is taken to the Sanhedrin, right? At the end of, before he even gets to the Sanhedrin, the centurion who is in charge of Paul before he gets his hearing in front of the Sanhedrin, the crowd, the sort of set-up crowd who are trying to get Paul in trouble, they tear their clothes and throw dust into the air, verse 23 in chapter 22. The commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, verse 24, and said he should be examined under scourging so they could know why the people were yelling about him. To torture someone who is giving evidence is standard behavior in a Roman court for non-citizen people. And it's required by law for slaves. Slaves were not allowed to testify in a Roman court without being tortured. Sometimes, as a matter of fact, the torture was completely nominal. They might slap you once or something. But it was required by law that a slave be tortured. It was not required that a non-citizen be tortured, but it was the custom. So that is what they're intending to do. So they bind him with thongs. Paul said to the centurion who stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" The answer is no, it's not lawful. As a matter of fact, it's a capital offense. This is very early in the Roman imperial period. There were still very few citizens, particularly in the East. And Rome took its citizenship at this point very seriously. And if you messed with a Roman citizen, treating him like a non-citizen, treating him in a humiliating manner, you could get yourself executed, even if you're a centurion, who's a pretty important person, right? The centurion hears that, and he goes down and tells the commander, "Take care what you do, this man's a Roman." And the commander came and said to him, this is verse 27, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" He said, "Yes." The commander said, "With a large sum I obtained this citizenship." In other words, I'm a citizen too, and I had to purchase mine. Paul said, "I was born a citizen." In other words, Paul is sort of, none of these people are socially desirable on an empire-wide basis. No Jews are socially desirable. Even Herod the Great was not socially desirable on an empire-wide basis. But being born a citizen is a whole lot better than being someone who bought it. So they back off. So Paul is a Roman citizen, and his father was a citizen, at least at the time that he was born. That's how you get born a citizen. So we know another fact about Paul. In the next chapter, they take him to the Sanhedrin in front of the high priest, and the high priest Ananias commands them to strike him on the mouth, and Paul rebukes him, and they say, "Is that how you talk to the high priest? You kiss your mother with that mouth, right?" And Paul said, "I didn't know he was the high priest." So that's kind of interesting, because that tells that Paul hasn't been around in Jerusalem for a while if he doesn't recognize the high priest. Because if you were a practicing Jew in Jerusalem, you'd see the high priest, at the high holy days and stuff. Oh, it's the high priest. Everybody, I think I would recognize the Pope. But certainly the popes before this one, since Pope Paul, if he were walking down the street, even not accompanied by anybody, I know what the Pope looks like. I never saw Paul. I saw John Paul I and John Paul II in person, both of them. And, they look just like you think they're going to look, and you'd recognize them. So not for him not to recognize the high priest, that's an interesting thing. It says, as Acts has previously told us, but people often forget, that Paul has been away from Jerusalem for years, for all intents and purposes. That's an important thing. Later in that chapter 22, before he told them he was a citizen, When Paul asks to speak to the people, he introduces himself to the people this way. Verse 3 in chapter 22, I am indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, famous rabbi of the age, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you are all today. I persecuted this way to death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of elders, from whom I also received letters to the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring in chains those, and I had this vision in Damascus, he tells them. So, Paul claims to have what we would call rabbinic training at the feet of Gamaliel. At the feet of is a technical term for was a student of. Rabbis who were professional rabbis paid for their livelihood by charging students for instruction. And so the normal way of reading this would be that Paul was, for a while at least, an enrolled student of Gamaliel, and that's his religious credential that he claims in front of the Jewish people. That's very important and interesting. Just as a note, what we call rabbis as a kind of organized thing, and what we call rabbinic Judaism, which is to say Judaism as it's practiced in the West, the kind of Judaism, you know, if you go to see a Hasidic group in New York, or, you know, an Orthodox group in Boston. There's an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Boston, in Brookline, right outside Boston. That kind of Judaism hasn't really quite developed. There are scholars, both Jewish and Christian, argue about this, but there were people, rabbi just means my teacher, and there were people who were called rabbi by their students, like Jesus, right? But you should not fall into the mistake of thinking that these people are necessarily rabbis in the sense that we use rabbi as a kind of equivalent, what would you call, mark of office, as calling someone a Protestant minister or a Christian priest, because that's not true yet. Rabbis never are ministers. A rabbinic position is not a position that involves public worship, by the way. They can lead public worship, but any Jewish male can lead public worship, right? But what we think of as rabbis haven't really developed yet. That's an important thing to know. So you have to be gentle with what you're imagining when you're thinking about Gamaliel or Paul or Jesus as being a rabbi. It doesn't mean like the person down the street at Temple Bethel. And by the way, any organization that calls itself Temple is automatically not a traditional Jewish organization. The traditional Jewish congregations don't use the word temple. So those are untraditional. Just so you know, there may be very respectable, nice Reformed Judaism, but Reformed Judaism itself is untraditional, just so you know. Okay. That's really about as many facts as we know. We do notice in that last little paragraph that I read you in chapter 22, you do notice that he equates zeal for the Jewish tradition with hostility to the way, capital W. The assumption is on the part of Paul, before he is converted, that if you are a pious Jew, you will be anti-Christian Jews. That's an interesting fact to keep in mind. That is one of the things on which he seems to change his mind when he converts, because you notice Paul is, after all, arrested in Jerusalem in Acts because he has gone up to the temple to involve himself in Jewish practices. So Paul does not consider, clearly, Paul does not consider that when he became a Christian he ceased to be a Jew. Before he became a Christian, he did think that Jews who had become Christians had ceased to be Jews, and that's why he was persecuting them. Okay, but he does not think that afterwards. So when we get to the very end and think about Paul's life as a total, that's something we need to keep in mind. Okay, because that's a very important aspect. We're going to talk about what people make of Paul and what we think Paul adds up to in the end after this once over lightly approach. And we need to keep that in mind. Okay, well, that's 20 minutes worth. Now let's look at this sheet which I made up, Paul, Missions and Ministry, which is two sheets actually. I did the very difficult thing of starting at the point in chapter 7 with the martyrdom of Stephen, where Paul first appears in Acts, and I went through and wrote down what I thought sort of generally goes on, so you can trace the activities of Paul through the rest of the book of Acts. It's something which is a useful thing to do as an exercise for yourself sometime. There's I did it for you, and I offer it to you as a possibility. There's certainly nothing official about my version of this stuff. If I did it again, I assume it wouldn't be exactly the same. And of course I put in the things that strike me, which are not necessarily the things that strike you. So doing this for yourself is not necessarily a waste of time, because you might like to include different things than I did. One reason why I sent you this file is because you can fiddle around with these files, so you can take mine and make it whatever you want. I change my sheets that I use for teaching and Bible study and stuff like that all the time. I almost never print something out and just hand it out without fiddling with it, except maybe a book list. I'm always fiddling because I'm always trying to make things better. And the fact that I think I always can tells you that they're not perfect to begin with. At least I can't tell that they are. So fiddling is a good thing. Can be. Okay, let's look quickly through and get a sense of the outline of the life of the Christian life of Paul as Acts presents it. Okay, Paul starts out as a neos, which is a Greek word for young man, like the English phrase young man. It's not a technical term. There's no way to tell from that the age of the person involved. I'm now 57 years old. Until 2 weeks ago, when my youngest daughter signed me up to run a road race in October and I started jogging again, I felt very young. Now I'm old and crippled because I'm sore from jogging. But I used to think, as recently as 3 weeks ago, I thought I was a young man. Now I don't think so anymore. My father, who is 90 and still works, does think of me as a young man. I think of my son as a young man who is 22. He would be a better neos than I would. But there's no way to... Paul's not 50 at the beginning, because 50's old in their culture. But we can't tell what age he is. He's not 7. He's probably not as old as 30, but you can't say it's impossible that he's 30. He could be 30. Anyway, he's a young guy at the death of Stephen. He's, doesn't have his career behind him. So then he appears again in, you get Philip and the Ethiopian in 8, right? And then in 9, you get Saul on the way to Damascus and getting there and having, that's one of the accounts of the vision. There are 3 accounts of the vision, right, in Acts. Then he goes to Arabia, just kind of goes off to Arabia, where, which makes writing the life of Paul difficult because we don't know where he goes or how long he stays. Comes back to Jerusalem, and then he gets sent to Tarsus later in 9, and then you get this Peter part for the end of 9, all of 10, and the beginning of 11, which is Cornelius the centurion, and Peter raises Dorcas from the dead and gives that great speech, "Truly I see that God shows no partiality," with the vision of all the different animals coming down, so we get to eat turkey because we don't have to keep kosher. Anyway, all that good stuff. Then you get the church in Antioch in 11. That's the first place that the followers of Jesus are called Christians, and Paul is there for a bit. Then you get you get Herod persecuting the church, killing James, jailing Peter, dying horribly, which he deserves well. And then you begin the activities of Paul sort of on stage. Up till now, his activities have been, he's been converted, and he's kind of receded into the background. Now he comes back beginning at the beginning of 13, and you get what we call the first missionary journey. Luke, the author of Acts, never calls it the first missionary journey, but it is the first missionary journey that is described. Some things that I thought were important I put in bold, like the speech in the synagogue in Antioch and Pisidia is important because you get a speech of Paul to Jewish people. We'll look at these things as we go through the letters because they're important examples. So that's an offering of the gospel to people who know the Bible, right? Because Jews know the Bible. Then he goes to Iconium. First he goes to Cyprus. Then he goes to the mainland, Antioch and Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, where they get mistaken for gods, and the pagans try to worship them, which is kind of that's as bad a failure as a Christian missionary can possibly have. To come into town, offer the gospel, and what you've done is reawaken pagan fervor aimed at you. That's no Christian missionary could possibly do worse than that. It's worse than getting cooked by the Polynesians, because at least if you're cooked by the Polynesians, you didn't make them any worse off than they were before. It's good to remember that the Bible contains, even St. Paul, who was probably the greatest Christian missionary ever, unless you want to count someone like Ignatius Loyola, has his own tremendous failures. And this is maybe the worst failure ever. So back they come and they report in Jerusalem. It's very important to see in 14:21-28 that they go back over the same route they went over before, trying to organize the groups they had set up and see that they have some kind of organized ongoing life. We will talk about that when we get to the pastoral epistles, and we'll talk about that when we read the Didache, which we're going to read close to the end of the class. So more about that later. Then you get the Council of Jerusalem. Interesting. Then you get, at the end of that chapter, starts the second missionary journey where he takes Timothy along. He goes to sort of the coast of Asia Minor, Troas. And then he goes across to Europe, Philippi, Thessalonica, Beroea, Athens, Corinth. This is then the speech in Athens, which is so important because that's a speech offering the gospel to people who don't know anything at all about Judaism and nothing at all about, they have absolutely no background. It's like, showing up in Borneo at the village where no outsider has ever been. And they've got the mud helmets on like you used to see in National Geographic. And there you are, and they're aiming their poison darts at you, and you want to preach the gospel to them. You can't say, look back on your reading of the book of Jeremiah, right? Because nobody can read and nobody's ever heard of Jeremiah, and they'll just eat you. You've got to start some other way, and Paul starts some other way with something they know. Okay, then he stays a year and a half in Corinth, so this is quite a longer missionary journey than the first one. And we actually have a date, which is remarkable. He's in Corinth, and he gets hauled in front of a judge, and we know the judge's name, and we know the dating of the judge being in office because at Delphi there has been discovered an inscription with Gallio's name in it. With the office that he's holding that can be dated. So therefore we can date when that man Gallio is in office. So therefore we can date when Paul is in Corinth. And that's remarkable. That's almost the only absolutely knowable date in the life of St. Paul. So clutch it to your bosom and remember it. And remember also how it's known. If you read F.F. Bruce's book, The Reliability of the New Testament Documents. New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? I think it's called. And, they're umpty editions, so the name changes a little bit. But he makes a great deal out of that, which he should. Okay. Then you get the third missionary journey, which is back again on the coast of Asia Minor. Ephesus, Macedonia is back in Europe, and then he comes back to the coast of Asia Minor again, Troas, Miletus, Ephesus, to Caesarea, and then he goes to Jerusalem to fulfill his vow, and that's when he gets arrested. And then he goes from Jerusalem, which is the part we just looked at. Then he goes to Caesarea and stays 2 years again in custody. And then he appeals to Caesar, makes a speech before Agrippa, and off he goes with, the shipwreck and Malta and all that stuff. So if you look at the life of Paul as it's presented in Acts, he's a year and a half in Corinth. He's 2.25 years in Ephesus. He's 2 years in custody at Caesarea. So that's 4, 5, just about 6 years for certain time passing with him fixed in place. All of the traveling stuff we can't exactly know. It reads, of course, as though it's very quick, but he's walking a lot of these places, which takes longer than you think. And it may well be that considerably more time passes than we are aware. When he gets to the very end of Acts, again, he's 2 whole years. This is verse 30 in chapter 28 of Acts. Then Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own rented house and received all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God, teaching the things which concerned the Lord Jesus Christ, with all confidence, no one forbidding him, period, the end. The book seems unfinished. It's hard to imagine anyone thinking that was the end of the story. I think that Luke to me it seems as though he's looking back on the time when this is happening, that it's not contemporaneous. It doesn't say he has been there 2 years, as if he's still there. The most likely thing is that Luke died or got distracted by something else and never went back to writing the book of Acts. There is no manuscript from the ancient world that has more than that, so it just stops. But anyway, so there's 2 more years, so we have about 8 years of datable time, and then all of the toing and froing, which is covered in Acts. And that's the picture of Paul in Acts that we see. Just to notice the obvious things, which I'm sure any Bible study class that's at all organized has a map to look at, ought to realize that Paul is going on longer and longer trips, farther and farther from Jerusalem. He's spreading the gospel. That's not hard to see. That when he gets to a situation where he thinks that he's got something to work with, he's willing to stay. He stays a year and a half in Corinth. He stays, which is a big city. He stays 2.5 years in Ephesus, which was a big city. He stays 2 years outside of Rome. We don't know exactly why. Certainly the fate of St. Paul, who has appealed to Caesar, and this early on in the empire, that probably would mean that he would actually, the expectation would still be that he would come into the presence of the emperor and have a hearing. It might only be a minute long, but that he would actually stand in front of the emperor, and the emperor would say, "What's up with this guy?" And they'd say, "This is Paul, who's causing trouble in the East." And the emperor could say, cut off his head, set him free, beat him and set him free, whatever. But that the emperor would decide. That seems to be still the expectation. As the empire, Roman emperors worked tremendously hard. Even a Roman emperor like Caligula, who was, meanwhile making his horse a consul and stuff, who he had fever and went insane, he was still hearing cases 12 or 14 hours a day most days. The emperors worked tremendously hard. And so they heard thousands of cases. Probably the best guess for why Paul would spend 2 years in this, outside of Rome, is that he's sort of waiting his turn, and there is no way in which Paul's case is of any interest to anybody on the Roman side. There's just nothing important about St. Paul from their point of view. So they're not going to rush him in there like, oh, we've got to figure out what to do with the apostle to the Gentiles, because they're just, that doesn't mean anything to them. So it is one of the things you have to say, that as far as the Bible is concerned, it's perfectly possible that Paul never was tried in Rome and that he died, the tradition is unified in attaching the deaths of both Peter and Paul to persecution under Nero in or around the years 63 or 64. We'll see that. We're just about to talk about that a little bit. And I see no reason really to date that, to doubt that. But there is that St. Paul's outside the walls, huge church, which is a beautiful church, rebuilt by a czar in the 1800s. I can never remember which one. A lovely place to go if you visit Rome. Is certainly purports to be built over the burial place of Paul, and it's certainly possible. The Church of St. Peter's in Rome, there's more and more reason to think that it's built over the burial place of Peter. Whether or not they've actually found the bones of Peter, they found a place that seems to be marked as the grave of Peter, and there were bones in it. But again, how are you going to check if it's the bones? Do DNA analysis, you just get, some male relative of Peter that you've gotten, check the DNA to see it as it matches. You can begin to see the difficulties. There are bones, and they were in something which was marked with Peter's name, but whether or not the particular grave that the bones were in is actually goes with the inscription is not completely clear. It gets to be a long discussion, but it's not completely clear. And whether or not they're the bones that were originally put in there, and whether or not, there's just no way to know that stuff. I think it's a very good bet that it is, but that's, Anglicans don't require belief of that kind of stuff, and of course Roman Catholics don't require belief either, though I could find you a dozen parishes within 10 miles of here that would think you're required to believe that, but they'd be wrong. That's okay. Everybody has ideas. One of the things you have to understand if you teach theology is that everybody's laity and almost everybody's clergy are completely ill-instructed. If you ask the average ordained minister in anybody's church a theological or historical question, you're almost certain to get the wrong answer. Nobody knows anything. That's just, it's the grace of the Holy Ghost making it all work. It's not because anybody knows anything. So I would say that's even more reason for a communion like ours, which needs to keep itself going. We need to know what we're talking about, because we don't have a massive structure of 1 billion people who are giving us money to keep everything going no matter what. We have to attract people and feed them in order to have sheep, and so we need to know what we're talking about. And if we do know what we're talking about, we will stand out in the crowd, because most people don't. Okay, we have our final sheet. Possible chronological table of the life of St. Paul, which is my title, not F.F. Bruce's, I think. I didn't bother to look it up. This is page 475 in my copy of Paul the Apostle of the Heart Set Free. And it's very useful to see this. F.F. Bruce, who was a very good scholar, was trained as a classicist, not trained as a scripture scholar, which I think is an encouraging thing. And this is his suggested outline dates of the life of St. Paul. What's going on in the church during the life of St. Paul. Not all of it is Paul, right? The public ministry of Jesus, for example, about 28 to 30 is not the life of Paul. You'll notice, first of all, the first 3 dates are all circa, or roundabout. And then there are 5 question marks. And let's look through and see what we say. The dates on the right are dependable. We know the dates of the Roman empires. We know when the Jews are expelled from Rome. We know when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, as we saw because of that inscription. We know when Felix is procurator of Judea for the same reason. Festus succeeds Felix. We know that for the same reason. Because we know Felix's dates, we know Festus's dates, I believe. I'm not sure we know Festus's end date. Later, Albinus... Oh, no, we do, because he dies in 62. Okay. Albinus, procurator of Judea, comes in after Festus. So we get 3 guys in a row that we know. And then the fire in Rome. So let's look. We have the public ministry of Jesus, which seems to be, judging by the Gospel of John, seems to be 3 years. At least. It's 3 years is a good bet. Paul is converted, Bruce thinks, quite soon after. It's really the beginning part of the life of the church. The church in Jerusalem has had enough time to be noticeable enough for Stephen to get into trouble and get executed. Get essentially killed by a mob. It's not a legal proceeding. It's, not a civil legal proceeding. It's a group of, worked up traditional Jews, kill him by stoning. And then Paul is gone. Notice the first conversion of Paul is about 33. He thinks about 35 he comes back to Jerusalem. That's after he's been in Arabia. So Bruce thinks he's in Arabia for some of that time in between 33 and 35. It's interesting. Other people have that be much longer. We don't really know. Paul in Cilicia and Syria, 11 years. That's 2 missionary journeys with the stayings, 2, and also traveling around. There's some mentions we'll see, and some of the times when Paul mentions things about his life, we'll see where some of this stuff comes from. At least because that's 11 years there. If Paul is converted in 33, and if he really dies about 30 years later, 64, 65, Bruce has him die maybe in 65, so that's 32 years. Remember, it's about a third. It's worth noticing, Paul in Cilicia and Syria, that little line is about a third of the life of Paul as a Christian. And what that line really means is he's wandering around in Asia Minor and around by Tarsus, which we saw was in Cilicia. He goes to Tarsus and he comes back for 11 years. That's a big chunk of his Christian life that we can't say a whole lot about. A little bit. There's some of the missionary stuff in there. Then he goes back to Jerusalem again. Paul and Barnabas. So that is that Paul's second Jerusalem visit, I think, would be the, this is off the top of my head, I didn't think, but I think that would go with Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem. And then Paul and Barnabas go from there into Cyprus and Galatia would be the first missionary journey, so it's not here's the Council of Jerusalem a couple of years later. Okay, so Paul's second Jerusalem visit, then he gets sent off with Paul and Barnabas, 47 to 48, to Cyprus and Galatia. That's the first missionary journey. Then you notice he's not certain, but the first letter that he thinks is written, which is why we're reading Galatians first, is Galatians. The inescapable logic of the letter, as we will see next week, is that it's written to a place that he has been. So wherever you put this first missionary time that he goes to Galatia, the letter to the Galatians, you have to put after that because it seems very clearly written to a place he's been. So that's why Galatians comes after the visit to Galatia. Logically, it could be any place after, but long tradition has Galatians being very early, and it deals, as we will see next week, with what seem to be immediate issues that crop up with the difficulties of being Christian. So they go back and they have the Council of Jerusalem, where they kind of work out what Paul and his buddies are going to have to actually ask of people who convert to the church. So then Paul and Silas. Silas, by the way, is a short form of the word Silvanus. So a couple of times he's actually called Silvanus, but it's the same guy. Paul and Silas go from Antioch in Syria through Asia Minor. They go into Europe, Macedonia and Achaia, which is the little province that has Athens in it. And after that, he writes the letters to the Thessalonians. Thessalonica is in Europe, and so he's got to go on the travel through Asia Minor and then into Europe, Macedonia and Achaia, before he can write the letter to the Thessalonians, which also seems to be the people he's met. Okay, then he goes to Corinth, which is, down farther in Greece, and stays there, you notice, for, a year and a half, from 50 into 52. Then he goes back to Jerusalem, and then to Ephesus, where he stays for the longest. He stays in Ephesus, I think, 2.5 years. Let's see, 2.25 years. Paul teaches in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. More about that when we get there. Paul stays in Ephesus for 2.5 years, and then he writes the letters to the Corinthians, which again are clearly, because he mentions specific people and also has greetings and stuff, more about that. He's got to go to Corinth before he can write the letter to the Corinthians. Then he goes again in another trip in Europe, Macedonia, Achaia, Illyricum. Then he writes to the Romans, which is, interestingly enough, clearly a letter to a group of people he hasn't visited yet. But apparently when he intends to visit them, it seems quite clear in the letter. And so he writes them and then goes off to Jerusalem, and that's when he gets arrested. So then there's the 2-year arrest period where he's in Caesarea waiting to be heard. And then he tragically, I have to assume providentially, it's according to God's gracious will, that he appeals to Caesar, which didn't work out for him in terms of getting off. But so he's sent to Rome and, has a shipwreck and all that dramatic stuff. Shakes off the snake into the fire in Malta and all that good stuff. Letters in captivity. He's in captivity. Of course, he could also have written the letters in captivity during the 2 years that he's in Caesarea. We don't know. It's perfectly possible that he wrote them then. He has 4 years at least of captivity. When he's under arrest by the Roman government, there are at least 4 years counted out in the book of Acts. 2 years when he's in Caesarea, then he has the dramatic journey that takes longer than they expect. And he gets to Rome 2 years there right at the very end of Acts. There are at least 4 years when he can write captivity letters. Lots of time to write captivity letters. It's one of the things that makes the captivity letters difficult. Another thing, we'll talk more about this when we read them. And then the pastoral letters, which Bruce credits to Paul. We're going to talk more about that when we get there. And then his death, he puts in 64, which is about a year later than others. You notice that Paul in Romans talks about wanting to go to Spain, and Bruce thinks that maybe he does visit Spain. It's certainly possible. There's nothing in the record that requires us to think he didn't visit Spain. Anyway, we'll see. There are a few things I want to say. We have 10 more minutes. First of all, there are certain letters of Paul that are generally agreed upon by modern Western scholars to be written by Paul. Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, First Thessalonians, Philippians, people are generally happy thinking that Paul wrote all of them. What are called? First of all, there's no such thing as a conservative scholar or a liberal scholar. There are only good scholars and bad scholars. There are people who are perfectly well-trained scholars who believe that all of the letters that are marked as Paul in the Bible are written by Paul. And it's certainly possible. There's nothing, we'll talk about this as we go along. We're going to read them all, right? We're going to talk about that as we go along. There is nothing that denies that possibility. Just as a note, the ancient manuscripts do not assign the letter to the Hebrews to Paul. The King James Bible does, but that's another question. There are people, there are trained scholars in the world who think that Hebrews is linked to Paul somehow, and first of all, Hebrews seems pretty clearly to be a sermon rather than a letter in the sense of that we would think of as a letter. But anyway, we're not going to read Hebrews because Hebrews isn't marked by the ancient manuscripts as being Pauline. There's no way to tell. I think we have to make a firm distinction in our study of Scripture between what we know, what we suspect, and what we can't know. Dating is something that we generally can't know. I mean, we can, if he writes a letter to the Galatians, whoever wrote the letter to the Galatians, it certainly purports to be a letter to a group of people that the author has already visited, right? So whoever wrote it could be artificial, and I could write a letter to the Galatians as if I'd been to Galatia. I haven't. I could write one that made you think I had. It's perfectly possible. That can never be denied. But if it's not misleading that way, then whoever wrote it after he'd visited Galatia. So if you think it's Paul, then you think he wrote it after he visited Galatia because that's what it presents itself as being. There's some things like that. It doesn't tell you when. It can tell you after a particular time. Anything is possible. Okay, that's one thing. So there are some things that can be dated, and there are some things that can be dated time after which. If Paul dies in 65, then any letter Paul wrote, he has to write before 65. That's an absolute date. You can't write a letter after you're dead. Okay? If he's converted in 33 and he writes as a Christian, he can't write any letter before 33. Anything in between 33 and 65, using Bruce's outline, any of those things are possible for Paul to write a letter, and then you have to figure inside of that where you think it's going on. How can you decide if you think Paul wrote a letter? Well, there are two basic things. One is you can think, what is the situation, the circumstance that this letter reflects? Is this a circumstance that I think existed during the life of St. Paul? If, for example, he writes a letter that says, tell Paul Linus that I really loved his BMW. I've never seen one that slick. It's unlikely that Paul wrote that because even though BMW is the oldest car company, it's not that old, right? And so therefore, if whoever wrote a letter, saw a BMW, it wasn't St. Paul. So something like that, if only it were that easy, right? Something like that demonstrates definitely that it couldn't be Pauline. That's the basic kind of argument that many modern scholars, they tend to be, of course, either non-Christian or from churches that have very little structure, and so anything either in Acts or in a letter in the New Testament that purports to have structure, right, bishops and deacons, they immediately say is not historical, because if they come from a church that has no structure, then they're pretty much committed to the idea that the early church didn't have structure. It's a wicked Catholic thing that comes in later. So therefore, anything that's got structure is not original. And if you're a liberal Lutheran, where it's all about Paul, and so anything attached to Paul you really have to pay attention to, then anything that's got too much structure can't be Pauline, because then you'd have to pay attention to it and you don't want to. That's worth knowing about. This is where the Jesus Seminar is coming from. They don't want any of this stuff to be Pauline because it's all unpalatable to them. So they date it way like Acts too. The picture of Paul in Acts is very distasteful to them, so they date it after Paul's death, and then they don't have to worry about it. It's just fiction written by the later church. That's one way. You look at the circumstances insofar as you can know them and try to figure out where the letter would fit and whether it would fit. If you are like us and you think that Acts is a dependable source, then of course you use Acts to try to see as much as you can of the situation, because Acts is essentially the only roughly contemporary document that talks about the first generation of Christianity. So this is what F.F. Bruce does, and this is what people like me do, which is to try to look at Acts and get a sense of what's going on in the church, and then use that to help you understand the letters of Paul. And then the letters of Paul can also help you understand Acts, because the letters of Paul are happening in that arena that Acts describes. So the Acts description helps you understand the particularities of the letters of Paul, and the particularities of the letters of Paul help you understand the generalities of Acts. Okay, that's one way. Another way is of telling whether or not something is by Paul. Another way is to try to look at the letters, and if you think that a letter is by Paul, like for example Galatians, then you want to look at the other letters that purport to be by Paul and see, are they like Galatians? If they're like Galatians, then you're more convinced that they're likely to be by Paul. If they're nothing like Galatians, if that's the only one you're sure of, then you would tend to think that they're not. There are some difficulties with this. One of the things you can do is to study the style of the Greek in the letters. Get to know Paul as a writer and then say, does this sound like Paul? To a certain extent, that makes some sense. However, this is now I'm looking at my synopsis of the Pauline letters in Greek and English. I'm looking at this is a wonderful work that is on your book list. It has a little section here called signatures, right? 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, and Philemon all have passages in which Paul purports to be signing the original copy, right? 1 Corinthians 16:21. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Galatians 6:11. See what large letters I make when I'm writing in my own hand. Colossians 4:18. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. 2 Thessalonians 3:17. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Philemon 19, I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. Okay. That reminds us of a very important fact. It was the custom in the ancient world for letters to be written by professional scribes. As we read these letters, we will see some of these people who actually physically wrote the letters seem to have been Christian, because they write personal greetings to the community on the other end. Some of the letters do not contain that material, and it is possible that they were written by professional scribes who were not Christian. You could just go to the marketplace and hire a scribe. As a matter of fact, in the Middle East, you can still go to the marketplace in any town of any size and hire a scribe to write a letter for you, because a lot of people in the Middle East are still not literate, and so that's what they do. What this means is that at least those letters that where Paul says, now I'm writing in my own hand, at least those letters, which is 5 here, are clearly marked as not having been written physically by Paul. What that means is that Paul is dictating and someone is writing. We have no way to know whether or not it's always the same person. It's unlikely, since he seems to have written his letters in different places, that it would have been the same person. What that means is that the letters in the original, the words in the original text, are not necessarily the words that Paul speaks. They are being written down by a professional scribe. Like my father used to have 3 secretaries at one point because he was writing academic works as well as running a department of surgery, as well as being a doctor with his own practice, and he had a secretary for each thing. And I know because he would record things all the time and then give them to them, and they would type. And the secretary who did the academic letters, who was academic papers, would write exactly what he said, because she was, she was not the scientific professor, so she wrote down what he said and he would correct it, right? The other people would, he would say, I want to write a letter to Professor so-and-so. Hi, Steve, how are you? And so I want to write a letter to Professor so-and-so. She's going to put this much on the page of all of the formal greeting and directions and address and all that kind of stuff before he even gets to the body of the letter. And then he would dictate the letter, and then he would say, sincerely, etc., etc., and there would be a whole lot of things. So a certain amount of that letter would be explicitly not his words. She would put it in, but those 2 secretaries were much freer with what they would put on the page versus what he actually said into the recorder, because they knew the people and they knew what he meant. He would say, Dear John, I'm looking forward to seeing you at the next meeting of the such and such committee. By the way, Margaret, who was his main secretary, by the way, Margaret, will you see when that is and put in the date, right? And so then, so she'd have to, fiddle around with it. Because of that, this is true of all secretaries at all time, right? So it's very important to remind yourself, I'm almost done. It's very important to remind yourself the letters we have to read are letters of the ones that are really Pauline, and we'll talk about this as we go along, do not purport to be every single word the word from the mouth of Paul. That isn't the way it works. What that means is that it is much more difficult to compare one of these letters to another and say, is this the same guy? Because as a matter of fact, it's probably not the same pen, and so therefore it's not the same person writing down what Paul says. Some were Christians, some may not have been, some could have been better at it, some could have been worse at it, some are bright, some are not that bright. All of these things figure in. It means that judging whether or not a letter is Pauline as a historical question is much more difficult than modern scholars often pretend, whether they're conservative or liberal or anything else, right? And so when you read an introduction to the New Testament that says, for example, Ephesians is too much like Paul, therefore it can't be Paul, which is what I was taught in divinity school, because of course Ephesians is full of, it's about the church and it's full of structure, and at Harvard Divinity School they don't want the church to have structure, and not too much God either, right? So Ephesians can't be Paul because it's too Pauline. That's a possible judgment to make, but it's much more difficult to make it if you understand the way these things are actually produced. So the closing plea in this lecture is that as we go forward, we need to be very cautious and self-aware when we try to make judgments about these things, because everything we know about the practicalities of the Pauline collection that we're going to study, and of knowing the history of the period, and of judging all these things, are additional complicating factors, not simplifying factors. It's very important to teach this in Bible study, I believe. It's very important for you to explain to people how this stuff works. There are a number of times in the church year where we get letters that, I think it's the one in Galatians. We get, this is in one of our lessons, see what large letters I make when writing my own hand. That's in one of our things. I think when that comes around, you should explain to your people how these letters are produced, because I think it is something every Christian ought to know, and it's something that it's very helpful to remind them. So we come to an end of the first class. The paper topic that I gave you is one that asks you to think about some of these very basic historical questions. How can we decide whether or not Acts is a good historical source? That's something we all need to think about, because if we can't decide, then where are we? And if we can definitely prove, then how do we do it? It's not only a historical question, it's an apologetic question, and it's something worth thinking about. Thank you for your time and patience. I will try to communicate with you before the second class and send you materials. I believe we have Galatians next time. Wait, here's my handy dandy folder. Yes, Galatians is next week. So read the letter to the Galatians, and see you soon. Good night.